Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining today's webinar on scaling climate and development action, focusing on opportunities today to scale access to reliable weather prediction for farmers. Enhanced accuracy in weather predictions can significantly improve agricultural planning and management, leading to more efficient use of resources and increased crop yields. According to the World Bank, precision in weather forecasting can increase farm yields by up to 20%, as farmers can better plan for planting and harvesting times and manage irrigation and fertilizers more effectively. Long-term climate data are also critical for developing crop varieties that are resilient to changing climatic conditions, which is essential for maintaining and increasing food production as global temperatures rise and patterns of rainfall change. Research indicates that developing and deploying climate-resistant crop varieties could potentially increase agricultural production by 17% in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia by 2050. Access to real-time climate and weather information is particularly game-changing for smallholder farmers, who account for 80% of agricultural production in Africa. Access to this information can empower smallholder farmers to make informed decisions that minimize risks associated with climate variability and extreme weather events. Mobile technology and apps provide smallholder farmers with access to real-time weather updates, market prices, and expert advice, significantly reducing the uncertainty in their agricultural practices. In Kenya, access to mobile-based climate information services have increased farmers' productivity by up to 20%. And one study in India showed that farmers who use climate-smart agricultural practices and real-time data services reduce crop losses by up to 30% during adverse weather conditions. Investing in advanced weather forecasting technology not only benefits farmers, but also contributes to national economies, addressing inflation and food security by stabilizing food prices through the reduction of food waste and improved market readiness, thus reducing the economic impacts of climate-related disasters and enabling countries to bounce back faster. Effective weather forecasting can reduce post-harvest losses by up to 25%, contributing to more stable food prices. We're focusing today on the benefits of development, but these services also benefit everyone. Improved weather forecasting services are estimated to save up to $13 billion annually in the United States alone, reducing damage to agriculture from extreme weather. Emerging technologies like connected sensors, satellite imagery, and artificial intelligence are transforming how climate data is collected, analyzed, and used, enabling more precise and location-specific predictions. Cloud computing and big data analytics are pivotal in handling the vast amounts of data generated from satellite and sensor technologies, enabling actionable insights for small and large farms alike. And satellite imagery analysis helps in monitoring crop health across vast areas. The deployment of these new technologies in agriculture could lead to significant increases in food production, which is critical to meeting growing global food demands while managing against climate impacts. So the benefits of accurate weather and climate data are clear. And today we'll hear from two initiatives working to scale access to this data. The first is the Systemic Observations Financing Facility. SOFF is a UN initiative co-created by WMO, UNDP, and UNEP. It aims to close the climate and weather observations data gap, especially in countries with severe shortfalls in such data. SOFF focuses on filling gaps in surface-based weather and climate observations, ensuring compliance with international standards, and facilitating the international exchange of these observations. The second initiative we'll learn about today is Aim4Scale. Launched at COP28 as a $200 million partnership by the UAE and the Gates Foundation, Aim4Scale focuses on scaling agricultural innovations that help smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia build resilience to climate change and increase productivity. A key initiative of Aim4Scale is creating advanced, scalable weather prediction models that can reach hundreds of millions of farmers within 2 years. These initiatives will highlight the important role of data and technology in enabling agriculture to meet the challenges posed by a changing climate and increasing food demand. And they offer scalable solutions that can adapt to the needs of diverse agricultural systems worldwide. With that, I'd like to hand off to Karen Kemper, co-chair of this climate change working group of the Scaling Community of Practice and an independent senior advisor, to facilitate today's discussion. Karen?
Thank you, Matt, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to this webinar. We have a range of very exciting speakers. We have Markus Repnik, who's the director of the SOFF Secretariat, Paul Winters, who is a professor at School of Global Affairs of University of Notre Dame, Johannes Lin, who is the co-chair of the Scaling Community of Practice that is sponsoring this webinar, Laura Tuck, who's a former vice president at the World Bank, and Matt Eldridge, who you already met, who's with the Gates Foundation, and I have the pleasure of moderating of what is going to come. We are going to start with two presentations. First, Markus is going to present SOFF and in which way it was founded and how it has set up itself for scaling and bringing about development benefits. And then we are going to hear from Paul Winters about the Aim4Scale Initiative, and he's going to give us a presentation also of about 10 to 15 minutes of how Aim4Scale has been set up and what it is trying to achieve. Then we will go into a panel discussion with everyone, both to dive deeper into each of these initiatives, but also to set it in a bigger development context. What is it that we are scaling? Why is it important? And what can we draw on in order to both make it work, but also what will be the benefits in a development context? So with that, I'm passing on to Markus Repnik to present to us what the SOFF initiative is all about. Please, Markus.
Thank you very much, Karin. Karin and colleagues, it's a real pleasure to be with you today. But it's not only a pleasure being with you today, it is a pleasure actually to be part of this community, the Scaling Community of Practice, to learn from, to benefit from the community, but also to contribute. Karin, you have asked me to focus my short intervention on SOFF, what it does, why is it important for development, and what are our scaling ambitions. Let me try to actually deliver on this. I've structured my brief intervention on 4 points. First, I would say the obvious, but not so obvious, that everything starts with data, so the importance of basic weather and climate data. Second, briefly present SOFF as a new United Nations specialized climate fund to support countries in closing basic weather and climate observation gaps. Third, build actually on what Matt already mentioned, zooming in on the importance, the economic importance of closing data gaps. And then actually really zoom in on scaling, actually picking 4 topics of scaling, namely our scaling vision, the scaling actors, implementation, and last but not least, scaling finance. So data, actually Laura Tuck, who is with us today, SOFF Global Facilitator, it was you who coined the phrase, the invisible but foundational ingredient. Because for everything we do, for everything we know about weather and climate forecasts and projections beyond 3 days on any part of this globe, we need data from across the globe. It is as simple as this. Data from across the globe. Now, believe it or not, it took until 2021 until the world community created the so-called Global Basic Observing Network. The Global Basic Observing Network that defines for the first time what constitutes the basic weather and climate data that all countries must generate and internationally exchange to the global forecast centers to actually deliver the forecast products we are all dependent on. Since 2023, this is mandatory for all countries. But while mandatory, there are huge data gaps. The SIDS, the small island development states, and the least developed countries, 76 countries together, have a so-called compliance rate of only 9%. So only 9% of the mandatory data today are generated and exchanged by this group of countries. Germany has more reporting weather stations than the whole African continent. And even more severe, the 39 fragile and conflicted states, home to close to 2 billion people, have exactly how many weather stations contributing to the global weather models? 7. So we have a huge data gap. Now, the World Meteorological Congress that established GBON, the Global Basic Observing Network, recognized that actually developing countries need support to comply with their mandatory obligations, and also requested to create a new specialized United Nations Climate Fund, namely SOFF, and as already mentioned by Matt, co-created by WMO, UNEP, and UNDP. So we are a specialized climate fund to support countries, to support developing countries in delivering a global public good. We are doing this through innovating finance, grant finance only, long-term open grant finance, and results-based open-ended grant finance, including tackling the elephant in the financing room, namely operating and maintenance costs of the basic observing network. Second, we are innovating technical assistance from expensive individual international consultants flying in and flying out. We are pairing advanced Met officers with beneficial countries' Met officers. Those who know how to run an observing system are providing hands-on technical assistance. Karam, I just noted that you're from the Moroccan Met office. You're actually participating today. So Morocco is one of the examples of a so-called peer advisor providing technical assistance to beneficiary countries. And last point is, it's really about innovating partnerships. It is a partnership on equal footing because the world is dependent on the data generated by Burkina Faso or Bangladesh. So if we provide support to these countries, it's for their benefits, but it's also for the global benefits. So it's a new equal partnership between the so-called developed world and developing countries. So we opened our doors for business a little bit less than 3 years ago in July 2022. Where do we stand? We are confronted with huge demand. 101 countries already requested our support. And we are operating at speed and scale. 66 countries are already programmed for support. 61 countries have already received or are receiving initial technical assistance in the so-called readiness phase. And 18 countries have already approved so-called investment phase support. We have been able to mobilize in about 3 years about $107 million from 12 pioneer funders, 11 bilaterals and 1 multilateral, the Nordic Development Fund, which is great, but is not sufficient. In order to correspond to the demand, we need 260 million additional, 260 million by the end of next year. And last point on the importance, then I'll zoom in on the scaling aspects. I was mentioning everything depends on the data. Data, the invisible but foundational ingredient. So there's a lot of science and research out there that actually states this. And the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, one of the global producing centers, a close partner to SOFF, has actually recently summarized what is out there in terms of known research. And the message is clear. Investment in observations is highly beneficial, and is even more beneficial if the investments are made where it matters most, namely in the so-called data sparse areas, for example, in Africa, for example, in the fragile and conflicted states. They're working on the second phase, actually quantifying the forecast impact using simulated SOFF investment data. Initial results confirm that actually there is a huge benefit, and most likely underestimated benefit in the past, in closing the data gaps in data sparse areas with particular impacts for Africa. And finally, we are now starting to look into the third phase of these impact studies, and most likely partnering again with ECMWF and their brand new open source AI forecasting model. So what is the importance of GBON and SOFF supported data for AI supported forecasting? So one aspect is better forecasts, but how do these forecasts translate into socioeconomic benefits? Matt, you already touched upon this. A study undertaken by the World Bank, UK Met Office and WMO concluded that the annual direct benefits of closing the GBON gap correspond to $5 billion. So this is about SOFF, the importance of data and the importance of closing the data gap. Now on scaling, I want to zoom in, as I mentioned, on 4 topics. Our scaling vision, actors, implementation, and scaling finance. Now, at the beginning, whatever we do, we start a vision. The scaling vision of SOFF has been developed in a very, very iterative and interactive process with dozens of organizations that came together and agreed we need to fix a perennial problem, namely closing the data gap, and we need to fix it together and in a new way. Already was mentioning new way, long-term open-ended grant finance and peer-to-peer technical assistance. Second, this vision is driven by a systematic approach. I've been now working for more than 30 years on development and climate finance, but I have never seen a space where there's more development and climate funding and money wasted. The world is full with a hodgepodge of failed observation infrastructure investments. So hence a systematic approach trying to tackle a perennial problem. And finally, a vision that is driven by an action learning approach. We know where we want to go. We have actually mobilized the community. We're doing, we're adjusting, we're learning. So far, so much about our scaling vision. A scaling vision is nothing without the scaling actors. Now, SOFF brings together 70 plus organizations under one common purpose, supporting countries closing data gaps, and actually under one institutional umbrella, an institutional and operational umbrella. Steering committee as decision makers, advisory board as advisors, including, for example, the big climate funds, and in terms of operations, already was mentioning Morocco as an example of peer advisors. We have in total 28 countries that offers the services of their Met offices as peer advisors. We're working with 9 implementing entities, UN organizations, and multilateral development banks. So we're bringing together the technical competence of Met services, advanced Met services, and the implementation capacity in countries of big UN organizations and MDBs. And behind this is we really create a community of practice, because with all due respect, it's easy to invest. It's easy to put a station there. It is damn difficult to ensure that this station delivers data on an hourly basis, 7 times a week, around the 365 days a year, 80% of the time, in countries in fragile and complex United States, for example, situations. So we need this community. And I think one of the key aspects so far has been translating the vision into a community of practice that also learns and adjusts. Scaling implementation. So 3 aspects. I was mentioning a lot of failed investments. We are trying to learn from what has been done and try to do it better. Second, also was mentioning, we are bringing together the technical assistance of peer advisors, advanced meteorological, national meteorological services, and the implementation capacity, the project implementation capacity of UN organizations and NDBs. They have the footprint in the country. And behind all this is actually sustainability, a sustained generation of basic weather and climate data. As I mentioned, it's easy to install a station. I can tell you many examples of wasted money, but it's damn difficult to ensure long-term operation of the stations. Hence, we have a results-based so-called compliance phase where countries open-ended are going to receive money and technical assistance to generate an international exchange to data. Now, actually, the last point of my intervention is, this is all good, but we can dream about scaling if you're not able to scale up finance, in particular in the current fundraising environment that you are all aware of. Hence, we are at early stages of creating and hopefully announcing the SOFF impact bond at COP30. Why an impact bond? A, we want to front load money. We need 260 million. We will not be able to get 260 million through traditional fundraising. We need the money now, front loading money that otherwise we will be able to mobilize in 5 years. Second, mobilize new partners, in particular public and private partners, including foundations, in line of the objective of the COP29 agreed new climate finance goal. So broadening the tent of partners, a diversifying group of partners contributing to SOFF through an innovative financing vehicle, namely the SOFF Impact Bond, a new financing vehicle for a global public good. So this is my last slide, and it's about financing through the Impact Bond. Where do we stand? The initial concept has been developed, a senior team has been established, and initial interest has been created. We've been able to mobilize seed funding from the Nordic Development Fund. We have put together a senior team. We have strong executive management leadership of the World Meteorological Organizations. And we have started to reach out to initial partners, and we received initial positive reactions. But we need to translate these initial positive reactions into a contribution to this fund, a contribution to structure this fund and finance the impact bond as part of the SOFF fund, because the scaling success of SOFF, and I'm crystal clear on this, the scaling success of SOFF will strongly depend on our success to scale finance. And for this, we need the support of all of you in this conversation. With this, thank you very much for the time you've been giving me to exchange with you, actually to present to you. I'm looking forward to an exchange, and I want to give back the floor to you, Karin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for this very stimulating presentation of SOFF, where it's coming from, why it's important, and where it's going. I'm sure there will be a number of questions. Maybe some we'll have in the panel discussion, and also there will be a question and answer session after the panel discussion. So I'm looking forward to that. In the meantime, we are moving on to Paul, who is going to present Aim4Scale, and he's going to give us a summary also of what it is, and also include a description of the early warning innovation package that was announced at COP29 and why this effort is important for climate resilient food systems. So with that, I pass the word to you, Paul. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Karen. So let me, I hope you can all see the slides. Let me start with an overview of what Aim4Scale is. It's the agricultural innovation mechanism for scale. And then I'll move on to talk a bit about the weather innovation that we're focused on at COP29. So the idea of Aim4Scale is that there are evidence-based innovations out there that have potential to benefit farmers but are not being taken to scale, and that we need to take action in order to get them to scale, that the current systems are unable to scale them, and that we want to generate the evidence but also figure out how we actually can take them to scale. In order to do that, we've created institutional structures to do that. In particular, what we have is an advisory and technical panels that are taking this on. So our advisory panel is a set of academics chaired by Nobel laureate Michael Kramer, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2019. They review the evidence available on agricultural innovations that have the potential to go to scale. We provide them with the evidence background, and then they make an assessment, is this scalable? And then for each of the innovation areas, we develop a technical panel. And in this case, we've developed a technical panel about weather. We're also doing one about digital advisory services, potentially livestock, other areas. And then again, in that case, though, it's a combination of academics, researchers that are working in these areas, combined with implementers such as the development banks. So the technical panel then comes up with an investment proposal to where should we invest if we want to take an innovation to scale. So the idea is that there are potentially multiple coordination failures, issues that are limiting the ability to take innovations to scale and to reach tens of millions of farmers, even though they've been shown to be successful at the level of 50, 100,000 farmers. We're not getting to the tens of millions of farmers. And so we've set up this process by which to do this institutionally to ensure that evidence is being used to push forward in these innovation areas, and that the actual projects then we support are also evidence-based and done in consultation with those that actually implement. So I'll give you an example of how we're doing this with the weather. Sorry, before I do that, I'll give you an example with the weather, but to see our criteria for selecting is rigorous evidence of impact and cost effectiveness. So you'll see with weather, Marcus alluded to this, we've done it more at a farmer level. We see incredible cost effectiveness ratios. We also want to make sure that there is a credible pathway to scale, that there's a means by which we could scale up this innovation. We want to make sure governments, farmers themselves are interested in these kinds of innovations, not something that are just driven by researchers, but that there's a big interest. And in weather, we had across the board interest from governments, from donors, from farmers we spoke to, everyone, and that there's clear delivery channels at scale, that there's some means by which to get in there, that it's not good enough just to have demand for it or to show evidence, but you actually have to have a nice pathway towards that scale. So this is kind of how we built out Aim4Scale. It'll be much easier to understand as we go through the example of weather. And what we've done with weather is very much a farmer-centered process. So Marcus talked a lot about the importance of observational data. That's obviously critical in order to get farmers good information. But we started from kind of, is this beneficial to farmers? What do we want? How can we make sure that messages they get, they're going to use, that there's quality weather information, and came up with this investment package based on the evidence. So the first thing to show is the evidence is pretty compelling about the value of weather to farmers when it's quality weather information. So that is a key part of this. Sometimes farmers will ignore weather information if it's not of the right quality. So you need to make sure that they're quality. Just predicting the monsoon in South Asia shows 11% increase in profitability among farmers. So when you tell them the monsoon will start on June 25th or July 15th or whenever it is, they adjust their planting patterns, both in terms of the timing of planting, sometimes the varieties of planting, sometimes the crops of planting. And so you see this shift that have been done through experiments, that farmers will change their behavior based on the information that they're provided. We calculate, because of that, $103 to $365 worth of benefits to providing farmers with adequate quality weather information. And we think we could reach 100 million farmers around the world in a relatively short period of time. We've already done this last year. We've reached 9 million farmers in India. For this year, we're already going to be getting to 33 million farmers. We're going to be working in Ethiopia, a few other countries. And so we think we can, in a relatively short period of time, get a significant scale of the weather information to farmers by working in a few key countries with high populations where there's already some systems upon which to build in which you can transmit weather information. So when we, at Aim4Scale, when we come up with an innovation area, we basically are saying, why isn't this happening, right? Where are the market failures? Where are the coordination failures? Farmers obviously would want to have good weather information. Why isn't it exactly happening? So what we do is we look at the entire chain for what are all the components that are needed to be invested in to ensure that we do a good job. The first is what Marcus was talking about, is the observation networks. If you don't have good underlying data, even if you're using things like AI-generated weather information, you're not going to be able to generate good information. So a key component of this, and we're working with SOFF and WMO to do this, is to promote better observational data. We also need to produce good forecasts. So you have to have that observational data so that you have a good forecast that is going to be a good predictor of what weather is going to come. In order to have that prediction, you need to have benchmarking and validation. So how do we know that it's a good prediction or not? So a third component of this is to make sure we set up benchmarking. And with the Gates Foundation, we're setting up systems to benchmark weather information to ensure that our forecasts are doing a good job for farmers so that they're actually getting the types of information that they need. The fourth component of the investment proposal is dissemination. So the farmers need to get the information. One of the things that we're finding is that they don't actually provide information to farmers specifically. A lot of meteorological organizations, they give you, weather for the next few days, but it's not tailored to farmers. It doesn't say anything about agromet type information. So if rains are coming at a different time, you might want to change your behavior in certain ways. It's not embedded in ministries of agriculture sufficiently. The manner in which information is provided is important. So one of the actual messages themselves matter. And so you do need to do a lot of what's called A/B testing to test how you do the messaging, because it will change the way how much of a response you have depending on how well you do. And so that leads us to our last component, which is learning, that you constantly have to have this feedback loop in which you're learning what are the best approaches to getting a farmer response. When people don't trust weather, they might behave differently than when they do, when they think there's a certain amount of error, the way the message is done. So you're constantly piloting and learning. And this is very easy in digital systems because you have lots of users and you can do little experiments with trying different ways of doing messaging and then just figuring out what works best. And so that can also then feed back to the other parts of the overall investment that you need on what are the best kind of forecasts. For farming, the ideal is you get some short-run forecasts, mid-term, mid-range forecasts, which we're getting better at predicting in general, and longer-term forecasts. Right now, you have the standard physics models, but AI is doing just as well with the short-term forecasts, and there's a lot of progress with the medium-term forecast with AI. I think the expectation is relatively soon we'll be able to do that. So feeding back to what kind of information is important to farmers is part of this overall approach. So because of all this and the progress we made over the last year and whether we did have an announcement at the COP, the announcement was of $1 billion. The way that we've set this up is that we do have this technical group of scientists, 5 or 6 scientists working on different aspects of the components that I just talked about. Some specialize more in dissemination, some specialize in the weather generation, in the benchmarking, and they form a team, but they're combined with implementing partners, the World Meteorological Organization, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank. And what we've managed to do is work with the development banks and their loan portfolios and in projects they're already doing, particularly projects that are focused on digital advisory services for farmers, embedding weather into those. And there's quite a lot of interest in doing that. And they agreed to work in specific countries. So for example, in Asia, we're working in India, Bangladesh, and Laos, and we're helping improve the quality of weather information and working through the development banks and the governments they work with to provide that information to farmers. In Latin America, we're working with Chile, Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia, and trying to do the same thing with the Inter-American Development Bank. This will obviously take time because the way that loans work is they take time to generate, but we are working directly through them. So the announcement was based around that. One other component of all this too is then training with the United Arab Emirates and Gates Foundation, who's been funding this. We're having training at the the University of Artificial Intelligence in UAE and the University of Chicago will be training people in meteorological organizations, but also in agri-met services and ministries of agriculture on advances in AI generated, but generally generated weather information and how to use these and how they can be used within countries. So the overall package then is make sure we stay focused on farmers, because that's our ultimate objective, is to get information to tens of millions of farmers. But in order to do that, to make sure the government is set up to do that with properly trained officials and with providing funding through the development banks, but then also making sure that we're working with SOFF, WMO to ensure that the observational information is available, that we're doing proper benchmarking, vetting the types of weather information that we're providing to make sure that we're providing quality ultimately to those farmers. So that kind of gives you an overview of what we're doing on the weather side. So thanks for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Paul, for laying out how Aim4Scale works. And I think that there truly is a scale in that. So as part of the community for scaling, this is, of course, very interesting to us, as well as the synergies with what SOFF is trying to do. So I'm therefore now moving to our panel discussion that we promised all of our participants. And we will start with Johannes and first look at SOFF. Johannes, you have accompanied SOFF for a long time, from its beginnings, and you have also studied SOFF in the context of the scaling community of practices, scaling and mainstreaming initiative. So now that SOFF is up and running, what are your insights about how SOFF has gotten as far as it has, and which elements have been important, and what challenges do you still see? Floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Can you hear me? Good. All right. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, also from my side. As Karen mentioned, I serve as co-chair of the Scaling Community Practice, and so I'm delighted that we are able to host this particular event, because I think it actually demonstrates two really outstanding, I would say, examples of how to design and ultimately, of course, implement scaling initiatives. I also thank Matt and Karen to chair and host this, Marcus, Paul, and Laura for contributing. And I welcome all you participants to the Scaling Community Practice and to this particular event. Now, I have to, as Karen already mentioned, truth in packaging. I've been involved with SOFF for the last 4 years, more or less, as a global so-called global facilitator, with my responsibility being mainly in the area of helping Marcus and the team to raise the resources that he, of course, already stressed are required to actually make this happen. But I have to say, and this is important to understand where I come from, I was not involved in the original design of this SOFF approach, which preceded my engagement. So when I joined, the basic parameters of the approach were already in place, and this is what I want to concentrate on in terms of the design of SOFF, and why I believe SOFF's design, which I was not responsible for, actually is a really good response to the scaling challenge. I did write, and I will put into the chat later on, I wrote a case study on SOFF as an example of how to mainstream scaling in funder organizations. It's one of 25 case studies, what we expect to publish and post on our website by this summer. So far, we've posted 14 case studies, in case you're interested, and SOFF is one of them. What I'd like to do in my few minutes that I have is to briefly report on the conclusions of this case study in terms of the design, and then say a few words about the implementation. Now, in terms of design, I see 6 factors, and it confirms to some extent adds to what Marcus already mentioned in his closing section of his presentation on scaling. What I believe are key aspects based on our broader experience with scaling and mainstreaming scaling, especially in funded organizations. First factor, very critically, you have a very clear identification of the problem, and with that, a very clear scale target and a very clear metric for measuring whether or not you're actually achieving or making progress towards reaching a scale target. You also have a very clear, very well-designed intervention that then actually gives you the potential for developing and designing, as SOFF has, the pathway towards reaching the target. Now, the GBON, the Global Basic Observations Network element of setting global targets, is a very important part of this, that we do actually have a general agreed set of targets, which is not typical, I have to say, for much of the for certainly much of the development world in terms of that specificity. Now, the goals that SOFF has set for itself are clear at the global level. It wants to reach and implement help the countries in the small island developing states and the least developed countries reach their targets that they are committed to under the GBON agreement, a very clear global goal. And that is then translated at the national level for the countries concerned into very clear national goals and targets to meet to help meet the global targets through what's called the readiness phase and the analytic support that SOFF provides in the initial stages of its engagement in a country to make sure we have a very clear understanding what actually needs to be done at country level to achieve, to identify the target at the country level and achieve the target. So very clear identification of problem, very clear identification of the metric, how you measure your achievement of the problem, and clear solutions and pathways how you get there. The second really important element that I would want to stress is the strong focus on partnerships in a fragmented, highly fragmented architecture of international assistance for improved observations, weather observations, and more generally, of course, for climate and development. The structure that SOFF has set up of peer advisors, of the implementing entities, and of other partners collaborating at country level and overall in the context of the advisory board is really critical. A third factor is that there's a clear anchoring in local institutions and local demand and linked to communities. A fourth element that Marcus has stressed is the sustainability focus through the compliance phase and the grants to actually, and the technical advice to actually support and the incentives given to maintain and operate and share data. The fifth factor is a strong monitoring, evaluation, adaptation, and learning process, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And finally, strong leadership. You need to have strong leadership if you want, and continuing leadership if you want to achieve impact at scale. Marcus as his team, now the WMO top leadership and support at country level from very senior leaders are all have been very important factors. Now, last a few comments on implementation. I think overall, SOFF has made good progress in many ways, but it also has a number of challenges. There's the strongest, perhaps, element of showing that it's needed and that it actually has potential for success is the strong demand and the national level engagement. We have very strong peer advisor engagement, which I think is absolutely critical. And we have maybe a big mix at the moment, and this requires continuous attention, is implementing entity engagement, which is not always easy to maintain and sustain. But it is terribly important because they are actually key links to the downstream investments that they also make in connection with support for early warning or for agricultural development, as we've heard. Finally, the main constraint that we currently face is financing. And this has a number of factors that I might briefly mention. First of all, that while we, I believe, have a very clear value proposition, and maybe Laura, you can say a bit more about that, it isn't fully understood in many places. Many funders in particular, but more generally, focus on the downstream part and think the data are just fine. Well, I think we collectively have to do a better job in making sure that funders and the general public understand that if you don't have good data, you cannot actually have good downstream engagement and support for farmers or whoever. Secondly, it's a new initiative, and squeezing a new initiative in constrained budget is always a problem. And third, you're all aware, of course, that currently official development assistance under huge stress, and especially with USAID now practically gone, and other funders, official funders, cutting way back in the UK, France, Germany, and so on, we face significant challenges. Now here, innovation, adaptation in your scaling approach is critical, in this case, in the financing domain. And the fact, as Marcus has mentioned, that we're pursuing now an impact bond for the financing of this is indeed an effort to innovate, to adapt based on the learnings that we've done in terms of our limitations and difficulties in fundraising. Let me close here with one last comment, and this is commenting on Aim4Scale. I have been working with Paul over the last 20 years, maybe, Paul, in connection with scaling at EFAT when you were at EFAT, and I'm now delighted that we can connect again on Aim4Scale, because Aim4Scale is actually a perfect complement to SOFF in terms of working on the downstream area. And we hope to make sure that through this complementarity, we can also strengthen the support actually for the upstream part that SOFF supports. But beyond that, coming back to the scaling community practice, I'm so delighted that with Aim4Scale, we have yet another example, and a really terrific example of how scaling is critical to help us achieve the goals that we've set in development at the country level. So thanks for pursuing this, and I look forward to collaboration. Back to you, Karen.
Thanks a lot for your insights, Johannes, on the trajectory of SOFF and your comments on Aim4Scale. I think we'll get back to that in the continued discussion also. I saw Sasha has posted the case study link in the chat for anybody who's interested in that. But with that, I'd like to go to Laura, who has also been engaged in SOFF for a long time, including from the very beginnings. And we've just heard about the elements that have laid the foundations for SOFF's expected results. But what I'd really like to ask you, Laura, is from your very long-standing experience in development across all sectors and the increasing needs for climate adaptation that you've seen everywhere. What are your insights when you look at both these initiatives and both their ambitions, how they fit into this larger adaptation context? What's your thoughts about that?
Thank you, Karen, and thanks to everyone who's gone ahead of me, and hello, everybody. So I think I'll try to lift our beams and look a bit more generally at the question you asked, Karen, about adaptation, and then end with the tie-in to SOFF. So I'm going to try and make 5 points. And the first point is super general and totally obvious to everyone who's connected, but I feel like I need to say it given what's going on in the United States right now. A lot of people, especially in this country, the first point is that climate change is happening and communities and people are going to have to adapt. Yes, we all know that. But a lot of people here in the United States don't necessarily believe that the physical changes that are being felt by the planet are caused by climate change or global warming. But the changes are happening anyway. At the end of 2024, WMO issued a red alert because these changes are going so much faster and so much more intensely than even we've been predicting over the last few years. So the point is, whatever you believe, you have to adapt, or you're going to suffer bad outcomes, loss of life, poor health, damage to infrastructure, whatever, if you don't build resilience and reduce vulnerability. So first point, climate change is happening and people have to adapt. Second point is that progress on adaptation has actually been quite slow. UNEP at the end of last year put out the adaptation gap report and showed that on a whole bunch of different indicators, that progress is slow and definitely not keeping pace with the acceleration of the climate risks that the planet is facing. Countries are doing national adaptation plans, but they have very slow completion rates, and those that have been completed have very slow implementation rates. To date, only 5 countries have actually assessed the scope and depth of the implementation that they've done, and all of them concluded that they weren't keeping up with the pace of the risks they were facing. At COP29 in Baku last November, some progress was made. Frankly, there was more attention on adaptation than in the past, maybe a little bit more in UAE and more again in Baku, but still not much really has happened. There was some progress, for instance, operationalizing the loss and damage fund, which is supposed to give financial support to countries that are facing or have faced irreversible climate change impacts from extreme weather events, and it established the Baku Adaptation Roadmap and the Baku High-Level Dialogue on Adaptation. There were some important announcements. Paul mentioned Aim4Scale. SOFF got a lot of attention and support, so that was good progress. There was a lot of discussions on indicators and how to measure progress on adaptation. But by pretty much any metric, the institutionalization and the advancement of adaptation under the UNFCCC framework was pretty weak. So second point, progress is slow. Third point, money matters. There are lots of reasons for the poor performance on adaptation. Of course, there's the growing political power of climate deniers who are controlling what decisions are being made. But a lot of the problem is obvious. It's money. The most vulnerable countries tend to be the poorest. Donors have coughed up, frankly, a fraction of what is needed and what they've committed. Funding from the Adaptation Fund, the GEF, the GCF has been flat over the last 5 years. But since I just made the basic point that we all know countries have to invest to avoid these huge losses, have to make investments anyway to build resilience and avoid and reduce vulnerability. When money is scarce, every dollar, every peso, every rupee, whatever needs to be spent super carefully so these countries can get the biggest bang for their buck. So third point, money matters. But that brings me to the fourth point, which is what Paul was talking about. This means that countries need to understand as well as possible what's going to happen to them. That is, very specifically, what climate impacts are going to face and when and where. And things like Aim4Scale. Paul talked about the $1 billion announcement at COP and all the work ADB and IDB and World Bank and others are doing that will help farmers get tailored forecasts and how these forecasts increase farmers' income and net savings. And these are great programs and they deserve to be supported. But, and that's my fifth point, there's a problem. And that's why SOFF is needed. Almost everywhere, I think Marcus or Johannes or somebody mentioned, there is some, or Paul, there is some form of weather forecast. Every country has a weather forecast, and there's some predictions about the future of climate impacts. But in so many countries, these forecasts are poor. They're weak because there are no weather stations, or there are few weather stations, or they're not where they need to be. The IPCC reports, when you read them, specifically mention that the lack of data in Africa hinders the scientific assessment of climate trends and gives very low confidence to the forecasts that they're making in a lot of these countries. And in all countries, as Marcus said, the forecasts are not as good as they could be because weather and climate prediction for one country depends on data from all these other countries that don't have the weather stations. And that's where SOFF comes in. So it's not just a question of developing observing networks. Paul put that in his very first circle, but ensuring that they share data with the global weather centers and that those stations can be sustainable. So all this fabulous work that Aim4Scale is doing could be even better, could have a better impact if the forecasts were better. And it's not just agriculture that could benefit. Marcus mentioned the study that the bank and the UK Met Office and WMO did that shows that surface observations lead to better forecasts. But if you read the report, and we could share it, it shows things like water system management improves performance by, I don't want to give the percent because There's some technical reason, but by a large percent. And thousands, maybe tens of thousands of lives could be saved, and assets and infrastructure could be protected with better forecasts, better than is being done now if we had more accurate and more timely early warning systems. But it's not just true for adaptation. So I put a plug in. It's also true for mitigation. Better forecasts than we have now could increase the efficiency of renewable energy generation from hydro and solar and wind. In aviation, better weather guided flight routing can cut fuel consumption by 10% or even 30% for short range flights. So all of the downstream investments that countries make, donors make, MDBs make, private sector makes, would have better outcomes and better returns if the forecasts were better. So just to conclude then, this means, and I think Johannes was just saying this, that there are major synergies between SOFF and other investments, definitely for all investments made for adaptation across sectors, and for a lot of investments made in things that contribute to mitigation, and for development in general in all the sectors that use or depend on the weather. Now, the returns to SOFF investments depend on other sectors actually using them, as Paul was saying. You have to put them into action. People have to learn from them, that we have to have good forecasts that communicate them, and people have to learn from them and do something different. So that SOFF doesn't get its benefits if that doesn't happen. So there's that synergy. But the returns, as I just said, to all those investments in all those sectors would be so much higher, and they would have far better impact and outcome and results if SOFF reaches the global scale, which is its ambition, and fills all those gaps in observations around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, to lift our sights a bit beyond the horizon and how it all links to development and how to deal with a climate crisis. You mentioned a whole range of things that I'm sure that Paul and Marcus have opinions on. So I'm going to give them each up to 3 minutes to respond to what both you and Johannes have laid out. And we'll start with Paul and then Marcus. And after that, we will go into the question and answer session. So Paul, any thoughts on what you've heard?
Yeah, 2 points. The first, when we went to the development banks and started talking about to them, these are task team leaders, right? People that do loans, people working in the field, people working with farmers, and started talking to them about weather. They were very excited, right? We went there with a big selling point about, weather's important for farmers, and there was nothing to sell. They had already bought it. The problem is, as soon as you start saying, well, we need to improve the quality of weather, et cetera, they kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, yeah, we do, but that's not my job, right? I have no means by which to do that. So as open as they are to improve, to giving better weather information to farmers, they don't know how to do any of that back stuff. So they're stuck on that, or they're focused, rightfully so, their jobs on delivering to farmers, et cetera. Even in Ethiopia, we talked to the head of the Agricultural Transformation Agency, and he said, give me better weather information, I'll give it to 6 million farmers tomorrow, right? I mean, he was ready to go with better weather. But again, with him, he kind of was like, how do you do this? So I think part of the problem is that while, WMO, SOFF, they're all talking amongst each other about how important this is, how you actually get it into the field and into the hands of farmers or other users is very important. So my first point is there's a coordination failure happening here that we need to overcome. The second, I agree with you, Laura, weather has all these benefits. And people bring that up to us all the time because we're focused on farmers, and they say, but what about this, this, and this? In the end, it gets the same as the first point. Farmers are among the most vulnerable. They provide a very clear kind of case for the importance of weather information. They're most affected by climate. The reports from maybe a decade ago about shock waves, half the biggest impact of climate change, half the poverty increases among farmers. So I do think always thinking of the end user is a very important part of this, and that channel is very important. I think one of the clever things about SOFF versus what WMO did in the past is trying to make more an explicit link to actions in the field and the way that it's doing the financing. And that's why I think it's a really great initiative. But we always have to think, we can't just be, if you build it, they will come, right? You need to build it for a very specific purpose and make sure that actually happens. And I think farming is a great example that sells well and also helps make a very coherent argument for weather. So I agree with all your points. Just don't lose the challenge of getting it out there in the field. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. And over to Marcus. Would also be very interesting to hear from you, Marcus, regarding the synergies of the two programs.
I mean, this question has at least partially been answered by Laura and by Paul. From my point of view, to put it bluntly, we are mutually dependent upon. What on earth is the value of a better forecast model if it's actually not tailored to the needs of a farmer? On the other hand, what's the value of a tailored farmer's forecast if it's not based on proper data? So I think this goes back to where I see, Paul, also the similarities. I think both of our initiatives aim at translating the scaling principles into practice. Both of us have a crystal clear focus. You have the end user focus on a crucially important target group globally, namely farmers, in particular farmers in developing countries. And we, from the other end, we just start from the beginning, namely the data. So mutual dependency. The value of SOFF is zero if it's not translated into better, accessible, understandable forecast products for specific audiences like farmers. And on the other hand, these forecast products, as we have been discussing, are highly dependent on data, and in particular in the context of now AI-supported forecasts. So from this perspective, it's no surprise that actually SOFF is part of the Aim4Scale partnership. We contributed to shape the innovation package from an observation perspective, and we are now operationalizing this and make this happen in real terms in selected countries.
Thank you, Marcus. And I see Johannes has his hand up. So for this part of the panel discussion, he gets the last word. And I'd just like to tell our audience that you can start writing your questions into the chat, and we will be able to pick them up from there. And we still have some 15-20 minutes. But first, Johannes, you want to say something about that?
Well, thanks very much, Karen. And I have a question for you, Paul. You know, I stressed in the context of SOFF, I stressed the sustainability aspect. And, you know, one thing we've learned in the scaling work more generally, if something isn't sustainable, frankly, it's usually not worth scaling. So my question to you is, under Aim4Scale, how do you approach the sustainability challenge or opportunity, as the case may be? How does that factor into the design of your approach, and how do you envisage, beyond your 1 billion effort and so on, to sustain what you will have hopefully have created? And let me just flag, we know, and you know, your main partners, implementing partners, if I understand correctly, are the MDBs. Well, we know from experience, the MDBs have a huge sustainability problem. If you look at all the evaluations, sustainability is usually the weakest part of project experience. And so my question to you is, have you found a way to address that, or how do you think you can address best the sustainability challenge?
Yeah, it is the challenge that you're saying, because we're mostly working with MDBs and then directly with some governments. It has the normal problems that you have with sustainability of how MDBs sometimes think about these projects. So we've been talking to them about it and trying to figure that out. We're still in a pretty early stages, so we're going to have to figure it out. One of the things, since we're working a lot with digital and trying to set up digital advisory services that complement existing extension systems, and trying to see how financially you can do this to, in some ways, save money on the extension system, but at the same time reach more people through the digital means. There's still some thinking that needs to go on between the complementarity between those, and extension systems vary heavily across countries. So some have been largely gutted and the others still exist, but they do have something. So we're trying to figure that out. But it is primarily trying to have discussions through the development banks and hope for the best with all the limitations that you've already noted.
Thank you, Paul. I'm here. We have a comment. We are now moving into our question and answer section until 11:25 or whatever the time frame is for you guys. So 25 past the hour, except for those countries where you're on the half hour, but you know how to do that and calculate it. So here we have a question that says, thank you all for your insightful presentations. Most of you highlighted the importance of scaling finance for scaling success. Can you say a little bit about the value of integrating the business model in our programs to create self-sustaining financial systems? I think there's a lot of thought that everyone on this panel has given to that. Who wants to start? Marcus, you look like you want to talk about sustainability in financing.
It goes back sustainability on what aspect of development and climate finance and action. The international community has decided that the basic weather and climate data constitute a global public good. Then why on earth should the taxpayer in Guinea-Bissau pay the launch of radio sondes that creates value for Guinea-Bissau, but most likely bigger value for Switzerland, where I'm currently located? This goes back to the basic point that we have not, as an international community, a financing model for global public goods. We still approach the fundraising for SOFF, catering on the global public good, through the traditional development climate finance channels, now trying to expand to a SOFF impact bond. And last point, the international community decided that this basic weather and climate data are corresponding to a global public good, are open and freely accessible. So there is no economic business model. We're now trying to bring on board those major sectors benefiting from better forecasts: insurance sector, reinsurance, satellite industry, other industries, to actually see if there's a chance that they could contribute to the bond through their corporate social responsibility. But behind this is the financing elephant in the room, financing for global public goods.
Thank you, Marcus. We have a question here. Someone from the Christian Youth Volunteers Trust has a question. Could you please type it into the chat and we'll pick it up from there? In the meantime, I wonder if any of you would tell us a bit of how that impact bond is structured. We've seen impact bonds in a range of areas, everything from water supply and sanitation, and the Rhino bond in South Africa. So they can look very, very differently. So it would be really interesting for the audience to know, what would an impact bond for SOFF look like?
Do you want me to come in on this, or Johannes, for example, or Laura?
Whoever of you feels the most called. You're muted,
Marcus, I think you're closest to it, so why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thank you for this question. We are not the first one thinking about an impact bond or outcome bond. There are currently about 250 of these vehicles around, largely in the social sectors. Very few in the sustainable development sectors, and even very few or even none currently in the climate space as impact bonds. What does an impact bond mean for SOFF? We would mobilize money, so the bond would be issued by an MDB. The World Bank expressed interest to launch this bond for us. Institutional investors would purchase the bond. and expect a return. Capital or principal and interest. Let's say 5 years, what we're currently targeting. So of course, we don't have the money to pay back. So we need so-called outcome funders. Outcome funders who will put money to this bond, saying if you achieve the certain targets, let's say an increase of data exchange by these countries by 300, 400 or 500%, then we actually bail you out and pay back the bond. At the same time, we need a guarantee function if something happens. I don't know, a hurricane wipes away observation infrastructure in the Caribbean. So we're currently looking into structuring and funding, potential funding partners, those who would actually put money and give money if we achieve the outcomes. A lot of pressure, by the way, on the countries to deliver. And those who would actually provide a guarantee. This could be insurance sector itself, or could be another partner or partners to pay us on this part. So one would front load the money, as I mentioned. We get the money now, issued through a bond by the World Bank. We will have the 5 years to provide the money to the countries to increase by 300, 400, 500% the amount of data generated and international exchanged. If we succeed, partners would bail us out. If there are problems, we would need to have a guarantee function. All this is currently in discussion with potential contributing partners.
I got muted. There we go. Thank you, Marcus. And I see a question here from Johannes, which actually I'll combine it with a question that I have. So Johannes here says that he thinks that the question of sustainable self-financing commercialist business models is also relevant for the downstream aspects of getting quality weather data and predictions to farmers. And is this something that Aim4Scale looks at? And I'd like to add a question, Paul, that is related to AI. You were mentioning AI a number of times on how through deploying the latest technologies, you can actually reach many more farmers. Can you tell us about that a bit? I think it's also linked to some of the financing and really going big and to scale. So while I know it's two questions, but they are also connected, and we'd like to hear from you about that.
Yeah, so a lot of what's happening with AI for weather prediction is by NVIDIA, the chip company that, and they're putting a lot of money into it. And the people that are actually working with us at the University of Chicago and now at the University of California, Berkeley are working with NVIDIA for weather forecasts. So NVIDIA is not interested in weather, they're interested in CPUs, right, to be able to sell their products. But they put a lot of money into better prediction. And right now, as I said earlier, they have models that are predicting short run weather that is equivalent to the larger physics models, but at a much lower cost, meaning they require a lot less computational power. There's a great graphic they use in which you go from a supercomputer to a laptop, and you're able to basically make the same type of prediction. It also appears that the AI models are better at localizing the information, meaning that they can be more appropriate to more specific local information. And they're currently working on midterm predictions, things like monsoons. And about 6 months ago, they told us it would take them about a year, but they are now telling us it'll be a couple months before they can get as good as the longer term, the other models towards making midterm predictions. So this would be the monsoon in South Asia, in Africa, El Nino in Latin America, that type of thing. So there's an interest among companies to do this types of things, partly for other reasons. And that's kind of driving right now the advancements, which are going quite fast. In terms of more broadly trying to figure out whether we could do this commercially, it's always a dilemma, because we probably could, and we could get the private sector to do it, but our focus is on small scale producers, and we don't want them to pay. And I appreciate Marcus' comments about public goods and global public goods, and the need to provide public funding for some of these things. I mean, this is one of the things, Michael Kramer, who I said works with us a lot. People always ask him, well, what about the private sector? And he won the Nobel Prize for Economics, so you think he'd be pro-private sector, which he is. But he says, there are things that are global public goods, and weather is one of them. And delivering them to the small-scale producer has a compelling social objective. And so there's nothing wrong with subsidizing that. And what we're trying to figure out is there's some way we can kind of balance at the country level, setting up these systems where they could have some sort of and places like NOAA do this, where AccuWeather and others use their data, but they package it in some way for the private sector. Can we set it up in such a way that it can be used by others under some license, but then also can be made available through government to smaller scale producers? So we're working on this. This is part of why we have a technical panel that focuses on this issue, so they can kind of think through some of these things. So when questions come to me, I go to the weather technical panel and say, well, these are kinds of the questions that we're being asked. Can you people think about this a bit and try to come up with some answers to that?
Thank you, Paul. Very interesting of what is going on in that field. We have many questions and that got through in the chat. So I would like to ask you, Paul or Marcus, to talk a little bit about the question related to the refugee community in East Africa and how such programs can reach farming and climate adaptation in refugee communities, which we know are very large at this point. And there's a lot of people really relying directly on the land of where they currently are, not willingly, actually. So anything you can talk about here. And then we have many questions from the Christian Youth Volunteers Trust, and they are broader development questions, very, very relevant. So I'd like to bounce that to Laura to give us a couple of minutes of insights on that. You two have in total, you have maybe Paul 2 minutes, Laura 3 minutes, and then we will go to Matt to wrap up this very interesting webinar. So Paul, 2 minutes on refugee communities and how your activities could actually reach them, and Laura on the broader development issues.
Well, a lot depends on how the governments are treating the refugees and the policies they have. So a country like Uganda has generally had a fairly progressive refugee policy where they give land to refugees and they're able to farm and they're able to use that land and get support for that farming. And in that case, you would be able to provide information to them on weather and direct that to them. If they're less integrated into the local population and they're in separate camps and not put in a situation where they can farm, it would be much harder to get information to them. So it really depends on the institutional context. The approach that we are taking is working country by country. So we're not trying to, there's not one size that fits all of this. And so we would look at the institutional context and see how we would address these issues in a particular country.
Thank you, Paul. And Laura, please.
Thanks, Karen. So a lot of questions. I'll just make a few comments about some ways to respond. So as I said before, first in UAE and then in Baku, a lot more attention was put on adaptation, and over time, a lot more attention on local communities and incorporating more diverse views into these perspectives. So I mentioned the Baku Adaptation Roadmap and the Baku High-Level Dialogue on Adaptation, and both of them are frameworks that lay out ideas for adaptation programs. And I think the questions about extreme weather, heat, and other kinds of issues that are affecting some of those communities, there are ideas for different actions that can be taken in those frameworks. But interestingly, at Baku, there was a big focus put on the voices of Indigenous people and local communities in climate action. There was the Baku Work Plan and the formally renewed mandate for the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform, which is the LCIPP, that helped to facilitate some of that participation and communication of ideas. So the Baku Work Plan specifically focuses on knowledge exchange, building capacity of these communities, and incorporating more diverse values and knowledge systems into climate policies and actions at the country level. And the LCIPP mandate that was renewed emphasizes the importance of collaboration between Indigenous people, local communities, and the parties that are negotiating under COP, and really tried to put a spotlight on an initiative called Voices of Change, which is focuses on resilience of communities and innovative solutions at the local level. So if you go through, I don't have all the details at hand, but if you go through a lot of these outcomes from Baku, I think you'll see this expanded repertoire and attention being paid to precisely a lot of those questions that are being asked here. Thank you.
Many thanks, Laura, for laying that out. So everyone, we are coming to the end of this webinar. Very, very interesting insights. Thanks for all your questions. And now my co-chair of the Climate Change Working Group of the Global Community of Scaling, Matt, is going to make sense of it all and what we've heard and what our key takeaways are from this webinar. Matt, please go ahead and close the meeting.
Thank you, Karen. Tall order. I'll actually be fairly brief because I think there's a lot of information that we learned today that it's worth digesting. And I first just want to thank everyone for joining, particularly our speakers, Johannes, Paul, Marcus, and Laura, as well as Karen, of course, and for everyone for joining today. I think what we learned is that technically there's a lot of progress and there's a lot to be excited about on the innovation front. There are a lot of initiatives that are underway to scale universal access to this weather and climatic data, which is really foundational for everything that we want to do to improve food security, to reduce price inflation, to build social and human development progress. The challenge, as with many things, is in how to finance it and how to build initiatives in ways that can be sustainable and self-sustaining. And I think we've learned about a few different initiatives today, SOFF and Aim4Scale in particular, that are making strides in this direction, and some innovative ideas that are on the table, such as the impact bonds that Marcus mentioned that SOFF is pursuing. But going forward, I think there's a lot of energy in translating all of what we know needs to happen to actually progress on the ground, to actually happening. As we work our way towards COP30 this year in Belém in Brazil, I know there's a lot of energy around concrete adaptation and resilience investments, and I suspect SOFF and Aim4Scale will feature there. So with that, just want to thank everyone for joining. The link in the chat includes where to access. There's the climate change group within the Scaling Community of Practice, which also includes webinars from past webinars, and we'll include this webinar once it's completed as well. So please participate, please join, please get active and involved. I know Karen, Johannes, and I would love that. Thanks, everyone, and I think that's it. Take care.